Appalachia, a word that evokes a whole passel of reactions. Everything from the beauty of a mountaintop to trailer parks, drugs, and about everything in between. The Appalachian Mountains are indeed the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch from eastern Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. The folks who live in these mountains have faced an unending number of tragic and just plain odd happenings that cry out for the telling. Hello, I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born and raised in these very mountains by a family who themselves were born, raised, and lived for generations in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Come with me and we'll take a look at some of the unending stories that come from within my beloved mountains, and we'll look through the eyes of an Appalachian at some outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 5 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. I hope you're doing well today. You know, sometimes folks meet up, date, and end up living their married life and loving every minute of it. Now, that might just go right on the end to the end, I guess, for both of them, but sometimes life might grab that big jug of love that they had for each other and pour it down the outhouse toilet. Whatever the reason might be, the two lovebirds end up in a split. A whole lot of the time, both of them realize that it was a best thing for both of them and move on without much of a problem. Then again, sometimes you have one or the other that might get worked up over the whole thing and decide that if they can't have the other, ain't nobody else gonna have them either. That's when the excrement hits the rotary oscillator and it's on Donkey Kong. And a whole lot of the time, one has to be locked up before it stops. But there's a few hard heads out there that won't stop then. They won't stop until they find the other, or the other is pushing up daisies, one or the other, in maybe a hidden grave somewhere that nobody can find. But so come on in and have a sit down and let me tell you the case that folks are still baffled about to this day. Danielle Imbo was born on August 7th, 1970 in South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to parents John and Phyllis October. Her father was a singer that went by the name Johnny October because his name actually sounded like an Appalachian trying to say October pretty much. He was good enough to be a member of the famous doo-wop group called the Four Dates back in the 1950s. They were the fellers that were the backup singers to Frankie Avalon, for you folks who remember him. Now, being that she was the daughter of a musician, Danielle was raised around and had a good ear for music. She was known to break out in singing every now and again and liked going to concerts around the area. She was just like all of us, too, you know. She liked reading about crime and murder mysteries, all while she worked her 9 to 5 as a loan processor. Now, those who were close to her knew her as a kind, outgoing person, as well as a dedicated mother to her 18-month-old son, Joe Jr. Now, Richard Patron Jr., well, he was born on August 29th, 1969 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to parents Richard Sr. and Margaret. He was known as a hard-working, laid-back, family-oriented, and a compassionate man. He was a devoted single father to his 14-year-old daughter Angela and worked at his family's bakery called Viking Pastries in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. Richard, well, he loved music too, especially that rock and roll music. I got me an affinity for a little bit of that every now and again myself. Of course, I've got a taste in music. It goes all the way to bluegrass too. And anyway, Richard, well, he liked watching football, was a big fan of the Chicago Bears. Back in 2004, Danielle's husband, Joe Imbo, well, he flew to Houston to see the Super Bowl. It was good enough to leave his wife at home with the baby and both of them having a nasty cold at the time. When he got back, he called a family meeting, which was just his wife, of course, and the little baby. And I can see him now standing up in front of his poor wife who's holding her baby as he announced that he'd met another woman on the flight home, and due to that, which is still a developing situation, he wanted a divorce. Now, you can imagine how shocked and hurt Danielle was, but being that Joe was a two-timing backstabber with marshmallow and a bullshit whipped in, she gave him a he thought she thought he wanted, and the two started divorce proceedings. Of course, like anything that happens to upset the life that you thought you built with your significant other, it did take a toll on poor Danielle. The poor woman's nerves were completely shot. She started chain smoking and dropped a scary amount of weight in pretty much no time at all. That was when Richard Patron came back into her life. I say back into her life because Richard and Danielle grew up in the same neighborhood and had known each other for most of their lives. Danielle was actually really good friends with Richard's little sister, and she'd lost touch with Richard over the years. I say little sister because that's the way I pictured it in my head. I don't know that for sure, but anyway, it was Richard's sister that she was good friends with, and she had lost touch with Richard over the years. Life has a way of sticking itself right smack in the way of things like that way too often. So if you reach my age, you know exactly what I mean by that. If you haven't, well, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but you got some crap coming in one form or another, and that's just the way life is. And yes, I know I'm not exempt from having more crap coming my way too. At my age, I'm pretty much starting to ask life if that's the best you got, because I'm still here. Anyway, Danielle and Richard hit it off like they knew each other entire lives because they pretty well had, but they are acting like they'd never been apart. They took right up dating from the get-go. Richard and he'd always loved Danielle and had never felt the way he felt about her with any woman before. His daughter said that Danielle was the first girl he ever really fell in love with. Even though they were happy and got along great together, Danielle was still in the middle of a divorce and decided that it would be best if she and Richard cooled it for a little while so she could focus her time on putting that mess to bed and taking care of her baby. Of course, that hurt Richard's feelings a little bit, but he understood how much of a drag on time and that kind of thing was. So he respected Danielle enough to just kind of stay out of the way and give her time to get all that stuff done. But, yeah, there's that big fat but again. That's when Danielle's soon-to-be ex, Joe's new romance, was dashed to bits on the rocks of life, and he come crawling back with his tail between his legs like a bird dog that knows it's screwed up by chasing a rabbit. Now, I don't know what the leg hound thought was going to happen, but I bet it wasn't that. The moron, well, must have had his morals all shined up and kept in a steel lockbox somewhere where he couldn't even reach them because he sure as heck didn't use them. He comes stepping back up like bygones were already bygones and things were just by God going to go right back to where they were before he told Danielle that he wasn't never coming home no more. He asked and fully expected Danielle was going to give their marriage another chance. That was a tough thing because she did really have feelings for the idiot, but still thought that a divorce was the best decision. After all, how was she ever going to trust the nutball again? Folks said that Joe was an overbearing, controlling, short-tempered a-hole, and instead of respectfully asking, with his hat in his hand and an apology in his mouth, he pretty much demanded reconciliation while erupting into explosive arguments. During one of his reconciliation meetings with Danielle, Joe reportedly got so mad that he threw his son's high chair right up against the wall. Of course, he denied that. On February 19, 2005, Richard was eating dinner all by himself like he'd been doing since he'd started giving Danielle space. He was eating on some of that deep-fried bar food at a local bar when he decided that, by golly, he wanted to go somewhere and take on some live music, and I just really didn't want to be by himself while he did it, though. So he called his sister Christine and asked if she'd like to come with him. She said that, well, she couldn't, but there was somebody who just might happen to be wanting to go with her that was visiting her right now. And you guessed it, it was Danielle, and since Joe, the backstabber, had had the baby and was out of town that night, Christine asked her if she'd like to go. Richard and Danielle hadn't spoken for a few weeks, but to his surprise, she said that, well, she'd go with him. According to local folk about the area, that Danielle was actually fronted her own rock band in New Jersey, and well, she was the lead singer. You know, she had the outgoing personality of that lead singer. After trouble she'd went with her two-timing husband, you know, she'd been through with her two-timing husband, she'd really got used to and enjoying Richard's gentler, more laid-back approach to everything. So it was on, and Richard picked her up in his 2001 black Dodge Dakota pickup truck, and the two went to the bar called Abilene's on South Street in Philadelphia, where they met up with Richard's friends, Anthony and Michelle. They watched the band put on a pretty good show, and by all accounts, nothing was out of whack at all. In fact, Richard and Danielle looked as happy as they could be. They were sitting close to each other, doing a little smooching in the bar while the music played. They had so much fun that they must have decided that they were back on. To hell with Mr. Two-Timing Control Freak, because they were talking to each other and perusing their schedules so that they could get together again next weekend for another date. Their friends, Anthony and Michelle, asked them to go with them to another bar, but both of them said that they had to be up early the next morning and couldn't stay up too awful late. Then at about 11:45 that night, they headed out. Somebody heard Richard say that he was going to drive Danielle home to Mount Laurel before he headed home to his place in South Philadelphia. They called it a very good night and walked outside into the night together. The next morning, Danielle missed her hair appointment, which she never did, and all through the next day, or the rest of the next day, her and Richard's cell phones went straight to voicemail. Of course, like with all of us, their families got a right smart concern. Danielle's brother John decided to go over and check on her. He used a spare key that she gave him for times like that to get into her house. It was dark outside or inside, and then nothing looked like it suspicious or out of place, which just didn't or add up and added to the whole mystery on top of it. Then at 3 o'clock that evening, which just happened to be the time that little Joe Jr. was usually being dropped off by his father, Danielle still wasn't home. That's when John knew for sure that something was really wrong, because she just wouldn't have missed anything close to being gone when that happened. Richard and Danielle were both close to their families and pretty much stayed in constant close contact with them. Wasn't like either of them to just go off and disappear without so much as a peep. When Joe the two-timer got to Danielle's to drop off little Joe, he saw her family there, but not Danielle. John tried to cover for her by saying that she couldn't be there right now and had asked him if he'd go ahead and take care of little Joe until she got back. That's about the time that the family started to panic and reported him missing. Danielle's family didn't give a furry little rat's rump what the police was fixing to do, so they wasn't about to wait no 48 hours to start their search. By nightfall, John and Richard's father, Richard Sr., were driving around the city and checking the highway routes looking for Richard's truck. They checked every side street and back alley between Philadelphia and Mount Laurel, and that was a handful, folks. They even checked the waterways and overpasses, including the Walt Whitman, Ben Franklin, Betsy Ross bridges. After running all night and not finding a blame thing, they went home. That's when friends and volunteers organized a grid search and covered hundreds of miles in every one of the directions. Now, they had pictures of Richard's truck and its license plate number, YFH-2319. Now, John spent $1,200 hiring a Camden police officer to commandeer a helicopter, which they used to fly all over the city and search from the air. But nobody found anything. According to one report, a deputy told John that he didn't think that anybody would ever be found because it was just too clean. Despite all the searches, not hiding a hair of Danielle or Richard or his truck was found. There were no eyewitnesses that saw anything of him after they left the bar, and they didn't show up on any of the toll bridge cameras after leaving, which they likely would have if Richard was driving Danielle home like he said. and then over to his place. And to top it off, when investigators checked both of their bank accounts, credit cards, and cell phones, nothing was out of place or out of line. Nothing showed up at all. It's like if I told the lovely and gracious Mrs. Bentley that I was going fishing up at one of my favorite places in the world, Gatewood Reservoir, and just disappeared into the Appalachian Mountains, never to be seen again. Well, actually, that's been done many times before. I guess it still happens from time to time. To me, it actually makes more sense than what happened with Richard and Danielle. They just walked out of a bar and vaporized. So we, along with their families and friends, are left twisting in the wind as to what actually happened to them. Now, as we all know, there are folks who are a whole lot like me who find something like this and get all obsessed up over it and trying to figure out what happened, which means that, we got a few ideas of what might have happened. One theory is that they accidentally drove into the Delaware River. That very well could be, folks, but people familiar with the Philadelphia area believe that was just highly unlikely because there just ain't no easy access or easy way to do it from the street. Then there's another explanation where they were carjacked and murdered, and the truck taken to a chop shop somewhere, tore apart, and sold for parts. That seems like a possibility to me because over 13,000 vehicles were stolen in the Philadelphia area that year, and the FBI and the Philadelphia Stolen Car Task Force worked together to ferret out that one, but they came up with a frothy warm cup of Jack squat that any of that even happened because they just couldn't find no evidence to it. Most of the time, the FBI don't get involved in the middle of missing persons cases. You're probably sitting there wondering why they got in the middle of this one. Well, I am too. And in 2014, which was quite a ways after the disappearance, Special Agent Vito Roselli, who was the investigator at the time in charge, put out a press release stating something along the lines of making two people in a truck disappear with no witnesses and no evidence of any kind for 9 years now suggests methodical planning. It's possible a perpetrator could just get lucky, but it's more likely to be exactly what it looks like. Somebody behind this knew what they were doing as well as when and where they were going to be doing it. Danielle and Richard were, according to the FBI, likely the victims of a murder for hire plot. I hear you, but that leaves us with who would want to hurt them and why. Well, the first people on the investigators' list were, the last ones that admitted seeing Richard and Danielle alive on the night they vanished. And that would be Anthony and Michelle, his friends. Both of them were dragged downtown and were questioned many times, but detectives finally believed that they really didn't have a thing in the world to do with it. So we go to our next contestant, who might be a magician in his own right, what with folks close to him disappearing and all, and he might be the one we're looking for. That would be the one, in my humble opinion, with the most to gain from it. That would be Danielle's husband, Joe. But it was proven that Joe was 50 miles away at a child's birthday party that day, a party at which his stepfather, who was a former NYPD officer, was in attendance. Not only that, but Joe took a polygraph test. The results were, let's just say unimpressive because it was ruled inconclusive. That usually means that they couldn't tell you yay or nay on the truth meter. And that's usually followed by another, but I guess anywhere I looked, I couldn't find where they actually gave him another one. But during their investigation, investigators found out that Joe had, the password to Danielle's voicemail and had gotten to her account several times in the months leading up to her disappearance. Another fact they found out was that Joe made a whole passel of threatening phone calls to Richard while he was at home and even at his workplace during the time, leading up to the disappearance or kidnapping or whatever you want to call it. Let's call it a disappearance. But he'd call old boy up, warning him if he didn't stop seeing his wife, well, something bad might happen to him. Because to a person like Joe, from what I've read, she was his property, not his equal life partner. But despite finding out that Joe was a A-class certified piece of dog squeeze, there wasn't any evidence that they could find that he was Houdini enough to make two people disappear, and of course he denied having any involvement in any of it. Nobody investigating the case have found any other suspects either from there on. Long about the time of the search, investigators did get a tip from what they call a waitress, about a broken gate near the Delaware River. It looked like somebody had drove a vehicle straight through it. They did a search of the river and the area, and they found several vehicles, but the Richards Dodge Dakota wasn't one of them. In 2021, the FBI released a new statement reporting that an extensive investigation to date has generated some promising leads. However, neither they nor the truck has been located as of yet. In March of 2022, a private Oregon-based search and recovery dive team known as Adventures with Purpose announced that they were working on the case. They're the folks that you see in the news going around finding all them vehicles that have been lost for years. They've solved 11 of the 36 missing person investigations that they were working on since 2021. They did several dives in the Delaware River. Doug Bishop, one of the group's members, told CBS, "I know the FBI's position is that there was foul play and that the vehicle has somewhere made it to a chop shop somewhere, but there's no actual information leading to suspect those types of conclusions to him. So our specialty is underwater. We know we have a couple that's missing with their vehicle, and we're going to do what we do best. And I guess that means go down and search for them. So far, despite all that, no evidence of what happened to Richard and Daniel has been pulled up from the bottom of the river. There is a $50,000 reward for information leading to the location of Richard and Danielle and/or to the arrest of those responsible for their disappearance. The case is still open and being actively investigated by the FBI, Philadelphia Police Department, Mount Laurel Police Department, New Jersey State Police, and the Burlington County Prosecutor's Office. The whereabouts of Danielle Imbo and Richard Patrone, as well as exactly what happened to them, is still a bona fide mystery. As we all would their families and friends are still holding out hope that the case will be solved and they'll be able to give their loved ones a proper resting place. Me? Well, I've looked at a whole passel of these things. I've read all kinds of theories on all of those, and the ones that have been solved over the years have had the most simple solutions, especially the ones that have the least evidence. I can tell you that the majority of the ones that I've looked at sure enough ended up with somebody just accidentally driving into a river, lake, or maybe a canal. And it always seems to be the ones that everybody thought looked like a professional hit because of the lack of evidence. The missing folks that I'm talking about were found underwater in a place that had been searched many times over, but it had been covered with sediment and most of the time some kind of a underwater washout or sinkhole that filled back up with silt. Underwater searches are really difficult and deceiving. Now, if I had to put my money on anything, it would be that they probably did run into some body of water somewhere. After all, somebody did drive a vehicle through a gate and into the water, which could sure enough indicate that they went involuntarily if they went that way. If anybody can find them, it'll be those divers who are working the case right now. As soon as that happens, we'll know more for sure. Now, folks, I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, Spotify, or Rumble, throw us a like, and don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you watch or listen. Come on over to Appalachian Murder, Mystery, or Legend podcast group on Facebook, where we talk Appalachian or about anything else you'd like to talk about. I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian Murder, Mystery, or Legend. I will see you then.